Okay, I am recording today for a sick student. If you become a sick student before tomorrow, your lab exam or later in the week, like just let me and Professor Rudd know as soon as you know. And I hope you stay healthy. There's a couple of important announcements about today and tomorrow. So first announcement is that there is a survey that I sent to you all in Canvas announcements, and it's about tutors. So I have made this survey for all the tutors for AMP 1 and 2 so that Professor Rudd and I can use this. And it also has the microbiology tutors on there because I just wanted to make it all at once. So please fill that out. Even if you never went to tutoring, the first question on there is, were you ever at tutoring? And if it's a no, it jumps down to another question that's like, what would be the best time for tutoring for you personally? This is anonymous, and it's just to give some feedback on like, how's tutoring going? When would be good times in general? And then especially if you had a really good experience with a certain tutor, put that in there. And then when we do reviews, like for work study, that would kind of be nice if, somebody's doing outstanding to get that into their work study review. So if 75% of the class fills this out, everybody will get 3 points on the lab exam 2 tomorrow. I would like to get these by midnight tonight. So if you haven't done it yet, it's real quick, like super quick. There's several of you already done it, but please do that today. So hopefully we can have some bonus points on tomorrow's exam. This afternoon, I will be down at the lab for open lab from about 1:50 to 3:30 this afternoon. So if you, like half the class has been to one already, which is awesome. If you want to come again, if you have this time available, that would be when to come down to the Nice Wonder Lab, and the door should be open today, which is helpful. And remember, tomorrow you have lab exam 2. So that's the big thing of this week for this class, lab exam 2. Any questions about lab exam stuff? Okay. So we're going to continue through our section today, which is basically about embryonic fetal development. And so this is going to be very focused on the embryo, fetus. And then on Wednesday, that's a day about contraception. And then Friday is a day about stuff that happens during pregnancy. So this week, that's the lecture topics. And then after Thanksgiving, we'll have lab exam. And I wanted to go ahead and let you know how I test on this section. It's a very particular way. So the way that I generally test on embryonic fetal development and also some pregnancy related events is a timeline. And asking you to put things in order or kind of know some certain important times on this timeline. And the beginning of the timeline starts from something called LMP that we'll get to in a few minutes. And the end of the timeline is going up to the end of a full-term pregnancy. And there are some major events that happen at certain times on that timeline that it's pretty important to be a educated adult to know what those times are. So that's the big exam question for this section is the timelines. So where we had started last time, we had kind of described, okay, what's fertilization? We have one sperm being the winner to fertilize this egg, got there first. And the sperm nucleus and the egg nucleus, right after fertilization, they would both be bringing their 23 chromosomes. So each one of those would have had 23 chromosomes. And when their chromosomes join together in the zygote, now the zygote has 46 chromosomes. And the zygote is the first cell that can lead to development of a new person. Zygote. And the zygote, after it forms, usually that's going to be in the uterine tube, it will start dividing as it drifts. So it's dividing and it is also drifting through the uterine tube at the same time. So it's both developing and it's moving. And by the time it gets to this stage called blastocyst, that's what will normally implant in uterus, is this stage called blastocyst. And this next picture is again showing where are we and what stage is that. So this picture is kind of starting down here with number 1 and going on through blastocyst, and it's just a different visual version. Did I say something bizarre? Okay. When I discovered after last week that Teams starts making a transcript of what I say all of a sudden. That was funny. That was funny. So from the time the zygote forms, we would consider it an embryo. And the embryo lasts for a certain amount of development. We'll get to that in a minute. But notice here, we would have had ovulation, and the egg starts drifting through the fallopian tubes, and it starts out being unfertilized. And then at some point, sperm meet it here. I might add on a few words here. Sperm tends to meets it in the fallopian tube, and you get fertilization in the fallopian tube, and then the embryo continues to drift and it continues to develop. And when it gets to blastocyst stage, which tends to happen by the time the egg reaches the uterus, now it can implant. So it can implant in the uterine wall, or in the uterine lining. A lot of blastocysts, we know this from studies in other animals, other mammals, that the majority of blastocysts tend to never implant. They just keep drifting, and they would drift on out of the body. If they don't implant, we're not going to know that they were ever there, which is weird to think about. But most do not implant. Maybe half implant. And implantation, remember, that defines what pregnancy is medically. So this particular picture, I really like this one because it's in color, and it is showing also the timeline, and it's showing implantation directly on the picture. So I want to use this to do the start of the timeline. And actually where we're going to start the timeline is from something called last menstrual period, which is this. I think I want to make a big, longer timeline on this board. And we're going to start the beginning of our timeline at something called last menstrual period. And what this refers to is the last day 0, the previous day 0 of the female cycle. And this is exactly the same thing that we were looking at back on these hormone graphs, which I think those were in a separate section. So I want to go back to that. So I'm going back to the last slide set where we had this graph of reproductive hormones and female cycle details. This. Okay, so last menstrual period would be equivalent to day 0, or the last time a female remembers when their period started. That's referred to as LMP. That would be day 0. And on this picture, how many days after that would ovulation tend to happen? What'd you say? You said different things. I think you said different things. So the question is, how many days later would ovulation tend to happen if a person is average, in quotes? On this one, it's showing it's at 14 days. Which is this black line and these, and then the bursting out of the egg cartoon event right there. So ovulation tends to be 14 days later. And that's a pretty major event. And for you guys, I would put this on like a big piece of paper, and we're gonna add things onto it both today and Wednesday and Friday. It's gonna be this long timeline of events. So in the average woman who has a 28-day cycle, ovulation happens on about day 14. And that's going to match up if we go now to the oocyte egg point of view. Here it comes. That's ovulation. And that tends to happen at day 14 of the female cycle, if you've got an average cycle week. So that would be day 14 of the menstrual cycle. And then at what point do you tend to have zygote after that? I don't know if that's very clear on here. So from the time ovulation happens to the time fertilization happens, that's not very clear on here. And we kind of have to guess at that. So something that helps with this is that the egg is fertilizable for about 48 hours. We can write that on the side here. Use oocyte. Oocyte tends to be fertilizable for about 2 days after ovulation. And all of this stuff that I'm telling you, you can use this knowledge to avoid getting pregnant, but later, if you want to be pregnant, you can use this knowledge to get pregnant. So knowing when ovulation happens is helpful if you want to get pregnant, because the egg is going to be most fertilizable for about 2 days after ovulation. And normally, by the time it's been 2 days, the egg will be somewhere in the fallopian tube, and that's where sperm tend to fertilize it. So the zygote come before or after ovulation? It's got to be after. So zygote formation is going to be sometime pretty soon after ovulation. We're going to draw that up here. So the zygote could form, and that would be when fertilization happens, if it happened. Very soon after ovulation. That's a part that is really hard to measure in living people. How do you observe that? So we extrapolate this from how other mammals their reproductive activities work. So as soon as, if there is a zygote, if there is fertilization, the zygote continues to drift, and hopefully implant. And the implantation tends to be 6 days after the zygote forms. So this timeline, where they're saying 30 hours, 72, 4 days, 6 days, that's counting from zygote to being time 0. Does that make sense? From the time the zygote forms, it takes about 6 days for implantation. And that's our next big event on this timeline. So if ovulation is usually about 14 days later, we are going to say that implantation I've been writing, I want to be consistent. I want to write the word above and the time below. Implantation is going to be about 20 days later. About 20 days later. 20 days since what? Since the last time the woman remembers that she had a period. So my first pregnancy, or like any time I've ever gone for checkups and reproductive health, and if you're female, they say, when was your last period? And like, maybe you all know, but I'm always like, well, I don't know about that. I don't really keep track. So I would like make some estimate, like think about it for a while and write down some day that I think that it was. The reason it matters is for dating how old pregnancy is. And they rely on the person to remember. And it's okay if you don't totally remember, but you know, assuming you did remember what was day 0, that starts this timeline. So implantation is about 20 days later. And then once implantation happens, then we start to get some hormone changes. So let's, well, go ahead and write this. We need to go write something on that previous slide. So the way that we detect pregnancy, the way that we detect early pregnancy, let's say. So add on here the word early pregnancy, because we live in modern times. We don't have to wait for the person to appear pregnant. So we can detect and verify early pregnancy by a certain hormone level. And the hormone is called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And what you need to know about HCG are 2 things. Number 1, you don't, if you're female and you have an implanted blastocyst, then you start making HCG. And HCG can be detected in urine. So you can pee on a stick, and they work different ways, but what is being detected here is this hormone level. So go back to this slide and make a note about implantation here. Implantation defines what we call pregnancy. And the reason that's when we define pregnancy right now is because we cannot in any way detect these events that happened in the in-between time until there is implantation. And then about 4 or 5 days after implantation, this HCG hormone becomes detectable. And this is for this year. So if you all I don't know, later get out these notes 5 years from now, it could be that we've got better pregnancy tests at that time that can detect HCG after 2 days. And they would be more expensive than other tests, but they might exist soon.
Is it be produced by?
It would not be produced by the placenta because there's not a placenta yet. I mean, it would not first be produced by the placenta. It could be that the placenta is also contributing later. That part I'm not sure. But this HCG spike is the first thing that we've got these days to detect if implantation happens. So that's the next thing on this timeline. So we're making this timeline from last menstrual period. What day would a person be able to first detect HCG if we're counting from last menstrual period? Could be something like that. Yeah. We're gonna put 24. So we're gonna assume they're gonna buy the medium price pregnancy test. Dollar store ones work, but you have to wait longer for HCG to rise a little bit higher for those to detect. So about 24 days. And I'm erasing the later because we're counting from day 0. So we're gonna say last menstrual period is day 0. And we're kind of creating this estimate, like when do these things happen in relation to each other? So about 24 days, you would have HCG detectable. On the pregnancy test. 24 days after the last menstrual period. These tests are so accurate now. Is this, like, if the woman is average, is this before her next period or not? Can be. Let's say if you're on a 28-day cycle, and you test as early as possible and you've got a medium priced test, you might be able to know that you're pregnant 24 days from your last menstrual period. And most people would not know this unless they're trying to get pregnant, honestly. Maybe you someday, or your partner. Maybe. So that would be first detectable. First detectable. And all the things that happened in between these times, we can detect ovulation. There can be ovulation hormone detection kits. We can detect implantation a few days after it happens. The rest of this right now is a mystery for the individual. So you can have fertilization, you can have the early stage embryo there, but you don't know it. And right now we don't have a way to know it. And so medically, because we can't know what's happening here, we don't call it pregnant. Does that make sense? Sometimes missed period can be a pregnancy, but not always. Hormone tests are the best way to know. How do you know if somebody really is pregnant? Or are they just late, or they have irregular cycles? So we kind of have a side note here. Most people who are doing super early pregnancy tests are people who are trying to get pregnant. And sometimes they would be doing that because they've had trouble getting pregnant. Sometimes people who have trouble getting pregnant will try in vitro fertilization. And last week in the news, Jennifer Aniston, who is probably old to you all by now, she's famous from the TV show Friends during the 90s. And she had this interview in a magazine interview, and she talked about, she went through IVF a few rounds and it didn't work because she was too old. But the way it works is take eggs, mix with sperm outside the body, achieve embryos, maybe, and then put them near the uterine wall so that they can try to implant. And so success of that depends on how good are your eggs, how old are you, and so on. But that's how in vitro fertilization works. If people are having trouble getting pregnant. And it's called IVF, in vitro fertilization. And it costs about $15,000 to $25,000 per time that you try it. It's expensive. Okay, so now we're gonna go back to, okay, we've got a successful implantation, then what happens? So this is showing, okay, here's the blastocyst, and it needs to attach to the uterine lining or the uterine wall. And then it kind of continues developing, and it first starts developing in the uterine wall, which seems weird. But the best places for this implantation to happen are going to be posterior, so kind of high up, and hopefully toward the back. So that's trying to show this here in purple. What are the most beneficial places for embryo implantation? So you want it up toward superior uterus and also posterior, because, and I see your hand up. I'm going to get to your question. And the reason those are the best places is so that the placenta doesn't end up blocking the cervix. So remember, cervix is down here. Cervix is at the bottom part of the uterus, so inferior. And if the placenta is blocking that, it's going to cause a more difficult birth later. Yeah.
Question was, so if the zygote,
Zygote.
so yeah, so as you were right there, since it fertilized in ovulation. When like, what is like the best time, I guess, like, and like that 14-day time period,
Mhm.
if they're not getting the test, I guess,
The best time to get pregnant?
yes, how do they know in the time frame?
That is such a good question. So to use this kind of info to help get pregnant, you have to know when you ovulate. And knowing when you ovulate, there are ways to know that. We're going to talk about that Wednesday more. But if you don't know when you ovulate, you don't have the information you need to get pregnant. And also you don't have some of the information you need to not get pregnant. So knowing when ovulation is a useful thing either way. Because whenever ovulation is, that's kind of your fertile window. Terminology is funny. That's when it's easy to get pregnant. But you have to know when ovulation is to have an informed timeline, let's say. Oh, well, this reminds me, one other word that we need to put on here. I'm gonna put this word in red, maybe. So the word conception, sometimes people use that word like you conceive the child or conception. Conception is about the same thing as fertilization, but we can't actually measure it. We only measure implantation. So if you see in the slides or somewhere else, 7-8 weeks after conception, that's kind of like, when does the zygote start? And we'll come back to that concept in a minute. Okay, so there are good places for implantation to happen, and then there are worse places for implantation to happen. And about 2% of the time, the embryo, which is what we call the new being after the zygote stage, up until week 13. And about 2% of the time, the blastocyst will implant in the uterine tube, which is not a good place. And the uterine tube does not have enough correct structure to actually support the long-term development of this. And we call this ectopic pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancy means that the embryo, let's call it embryo. The embryo implants in a location that can't support long-term development. So that is what ectopic pregnancy is. And depending on where that unfortunate location is, if it's in the tube, that's called a tubal pregnancy. And if it's too low down next to the cervix, that's called a cervical pregnancy. And both of these places do not have the correct anatomy to support long-term embryonic development. They will support the embryo to develop for a while. So these ectopic pregnancies, they will produce, so they will increase HCG levels, and they can be detected on a pregnancy test, and they will continue to develop until they don't. So you would have a positive pregnancy test, but unfortunately, these will die usually before 10 weeks. So you will know people that this happens to. It might happen to you. Get pregnancy, positive pregnancy. And in these days when there's social media, I've had friends that announce like, we're pregnant, you know, like not close friends. And then after a while, you're like, I thought they were pregnant. They should have had that baby by now. So whenever you all later in life, if you announce an early pregnancy, you need to think about, would I announce a pregnancy loss also? So the first trimester tends to have more pregnancy loss. And it's a good thing these days, people are a lot more open about that. And I think that's probably a good thing. Probably a good thing. So the other thing to note about this, we cannot move them. We do not currently have the technology. Once we know, if we know that a pregnancy is tubal or cervical, we do not have microsurgical capabilities to move that embryo to a new spot. So these ectopic pregnancies are going to be lost. And if they're in the fallopian tube, if you allow the loss to proceed naturally, it can rupture the tube and it can cause hemorrhaging in the mom. And that is a very important fact when we're talking about stages of when we allow abortion and not. Because there will be women who very much wanted to get pregnant and they were very happy to have a positive pregnancy test, and then they find out it's in the uterine tube. And if they don't want their tube to rupture, they are going to need an abortion. Like that is a big contentious thing. Like, is that a fact or is that not a fact? It is a fact. Even if they want this desperately, there's not a chance for it. And they can do nothing and let it rupture, which would then, if you've got this side ruptured, you've kind of lost that side, half your fertility right there. So that's very important fact. We can't move them yet. We can't, I don't know, there's terrible choices to have to make if that happens. And I've had this happen to students I've taught long enough, like later they came back and told me that happened to me. So we're gonna now assume we had implantation in a good spot, and the embryo is going to keep developing and keep living. And as it is continuing to develop, there will be this very important structure formed between the embryo and the mother, and it's called placenta. The placenta. And the placenta starts developing pretty soon after implantation. And it will finish developing at about 16 weeks of pregnancy. And the placenta is allowing good things from the mom to go into the fetus. And it's allowing wastes from the fetus to go back into the mom. So it's an exchange organ. And it's very important that it form properly. And we hope that it does not form blocking the cervix. So these are some things that can cross through the placenta. And you'll learn more about that if you go into nursing school. But wherever implantation happens, that's where the placenta is going to form. And the connection point between the embryo and the placenta is the umbilical cord, which went into your belly button. I was not aware that, like, I always heard of umbilical cord, and I know I have a belly button. The connection did not. I was ridiculously old before I realized that. This is a real placenta, the real size of it. And I didn't know until I was pregnant that you have to deliver it. You deliver the baby, but then you're not done. You also deliver the placenta, which is easier, but it's kind of annoying when you're at that point. So that's the placenta. And you can see here, this is the umbilical cord connecting. So it's quite large in a healthy pregnancy. This was a quiz. Maybe this is your quiz for next time.
Okay.
It was today? Oh, because we're a little bit behind, maybe. Yeah. Some of that info, I don't actually talk about it in lecture until later. That's the quiz for today. So this picture is not from OpenStax, and this is one I think is incredibly useful and not enough. We don't look at it enough, or maybe you've never seen something like this, but this is what's called Carnegie stages. And Carnegie stages are describing different developmental milestones of the embryo. So first off, everything on this page, on these pictures, is considered embryonic development. So these stages have numbers on them, and we're not going to focus on the big yellow numbers. Those are arbitrary numbers of, like, when it's at stage 12, it tends to look like this. This is how old it is. We're going to focus more on actually, on this timeline, how old is the embryo in relation to last menstrual period. Something else to notice on here is there is a scale bar. So this scale bar is 5 millimeters. And you can kind of use that to extrapolate how big is this embryo here. We've got zygote here, and this is showing it magnified. So this would be the actual size of zygote. And if you take if you've got a pencil, which you may or may not, if you take your pencil and you make the smallest dot you can on your page, that's about the size of a zygote. So it's very small. It's a fraction of a millimeter, and then it quickly is going to divide and go through these stages. Next thing to note about this picture is they are starting from the day the zygote formed. So these days do not quite line up with these days. So to get, make a note here, we need to add 14 days, about 14 days, to convert these developmental stages to our timeline over here. And I don't know how well you can read these underneath here. So if we say that the zygote on this scale is day 1, which day did we have implantation? How many days is it from when the zygote forms to implantation usually? How many days? That's from last menstrual period. It's about 4 or 5 days from when the zygote forms to when it implants. And so implantation is going to be about this stage right here. So it's still a ball-shaped blastocyst. So we have implantation about here. And I have drawn this arrow in right here because that would be what we consider 6 weeks pregnant. So this is the time frame that would represent about 6 weeks pregnant, because that's like a very important stage time frame in determining who, like some states would say you can't have an abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. So the reason I'm making a big deal about this 14 days adding on thing is that if these are the stages since the zygote formed, and it takes 14 days before ovulation, if we want to know what stage of pregnancy on our timeline here, that's what we know to reference this to if someone says, I am X weeks pregnant. And this is kind of a complicated concept, so I want to go kind of slow through this. When you first, if you're trying to detect pregnancy as early as possible, and maybe you can detect it at 24 days, and then you call the doctor's office and they say, yeah, come in in a couple of weeks and we'll confirm it. Not tomorrow? No, like come in a couple of weeks, we'll confirm it. And then because they will ask you, when was your last menstrual period? That's when they start the pregnancy timeline. So what we're writing here is a pregnancy timeline. Because we can't actually figure out when fertilization happened. We can only know when the last menstrual period happened. So by the time that you can first detect that you're pregnant, you're about 3.5 weeks pregnant. So this time point here, you would call 3.5 weeks pregnant. Is the earliest that you can know if you're super motivated to know, and if you've got totally regular menstrual cycle. So by the time you are 6 weeks pregnant, you are 6 weeks pregnant, the embryo has existed for about 28 days, something like that, because you can't have a zygote till you ovulate, and ovulate is about 2 weeks after last menstrual period. So 6 weeks pregnant is about this stage of embryonic development. And then this arrow, I don't remember why. Oh, I know what that arrow is. I know what that arrow is. It's going to make sense in a minute. Maybe also before we leave this embryo is 56 to 60 days old. So if it was 56 and we divide that by 7 to get weeks, it's 8 weeks. This would be like a 10-week. Yeah. This one is about 10 weeks pregnant. But the embryo has existed for about 8 weeks. Still quite small. this is why I think it's very important to know this stuff. So this, I got this off of social media several weeks ago, not several weeks ago, several years ago. And it's got a mixture of things that are true and things that are not true. It is true that this is a human embryo. Baby is actually not a medical word. It is definitely an embryo, whether it's a baby, kind of depends on your views. It is in the womb. It is not 3 weeks. Like, it's not 3 weeks pregnant. It's also not 3 weeks of embryo development. So compare kind of how that looks, which is kind of like around here. So that's what that yellow arrow is, like how old actually is that embryo? It's not 3 weeks pregnant. It's not even 3 weeks of embryonic development, which would be back here. So it is true that the foundation for all the organ systems are starting to develop at this stage. It's the time that they have on here that is not actually correct. So this very important if we're going to define things about embryos and to know, like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? How big is it? How developed is it? This is actually a 3-week embryonic development. 6 weeks of pregnancy is here. 3. Oh yeah, okay. So this arrow is showing about how old this embryo really is. Also note 12 weeks is past all of this. So it may seem like 6 weeks and 12 weeks are really close together. They are. There's a huge amount of development that takes place in there. And it's just like everyone should look at this. Make sure you know what you're talking about so that you know what you're talking about. I don't think I have anything particular to say about this. I know what I was going to say about this. So if you asked me, like, what are my views about when does personhood start? This is an important question for everybody to think about for themselves. It would be somewhere between this and this for me personally. This is week 9. Week 12 is quite far along about this. So some advice that I have for females is to know, when do you think you ovulate? What is your cycle length? Keep a close eye on whether or not you are pregnant if you don't want to be pregnant, because your time is shorter than it used to be to make hard decisions. You can't know you're pregnant until you're already 3.5 weeks pregnant at the earliest. And what state you live in is going to depend on how close of an eye do you have to keep on this. So something else that I want you to definitely know for this next test is some certain definitions. This is a place where definitions really matter in this class. And most of them that are important to me are on this one slide. Whoops, let's make it all. So the zygote is the first cell of the new individual. It's a single cell. It happens from fertilization. Pregnancy, the definition of being pregnant is you have had implantation. And you can change this. I haven't changed this in a few years. We need to change it to 4 to 5. Yeah, 4 to 5 days after fertilization, because tests get a little bit more sensitive every year. And you can first know that you're pregnant about 3 weeks from your last menstrual period. Very important to note, we count pregnancy weeks from day 0 of the last menstrual period. And that's what this timeline is set up to be pregnancy weeks, is what we're working on here. And now we turn to, okay, what are the medical words to describe the new being? So embryo, by the time that we can detect someone is pregnant, it is an embryo. And so the embryonic stage is from about weeks 3 to up through week 8 weeks pregnant. And then after that, the medical word is fetus. Now, what people call it really depends on what their attitude is. And if you have a friend that has a pregnancy loss, you would never say, "I'm so sorry about your embryo," or "I'm so sorry you lost your fetus." You would say baby. You know what I mean? So fetus from 9th week of pregnancy onward, embryo up until that, the pre-embryonic. That's the time that we can't know what's going on or can't detect. So that's pre-embryonic. And really this should be the first 3 weeks. That's the mystery time. We don't know, we can't detect. We call that pre-embryonic. So we could put on here, let's add something new onto this. So starting from implantation up to about 8 weeks, we call that embryonic stage. And before that, it is called pre-embryonic. And after that, it is fetal stage, and that will continue until birth, whenever birth is. It's fetal stage, or we would call the being the fetus. Oh, something else very important. Is the question about heartbeat. Okay, so the 6-week time frame was kind of picked out as being important because at 6 weeks you can detect the heartbeat. So embryonic heartbeat. 6 weeks, they have a primitive structure that is like a heart, but it doesn't have all the chambers yet. But it is doing the electrical impulses that can be detected, and that's why you wait until 6 weeks until you go for the appointment, because they're trying to confirm by hearing that electrical activity. So they have a primordial heart. Doesn't have all the chamber structure yet, but it has electrical activity that we can detect. And it starts out super fast. It doesn't sound like that, but that's like kind of the speed of it. So when they detect. So that's one reason why 6 weeks has been picked out as a important time frame, because there is some electrical activity. Calling it a heartbeat kind of depends on what do you call a heart? Does it have to have all 4 chambers? Does it have to have ventricles and atria yet? But you can detect electrical activity at that time. The next really important time frame for a fetus by this point is what we call viability. So we kind of, I'm gonna put like a break, one of those things that indicates like we're skipping over some time so that we can fit this on one board. So this year, 2022, if you live in a fairly close to a metro area and you start to go into labor at 23 weeks pregnant, there will be attempts to save the baby once it's out, once it's born. They will have a chance. If it's before 23 weeks, or if you are in the middle of nowhere, like in Montana or Alaska or somewhere like that, and you can't get to a good modern hospital in time, they will not try to save the baby once it's born. That's kind of harsh, but this is also really important to know as far as timeline. So when people are pregnant and they make it to 25 weeks, that's kind of a breathe easier moment, because even if the baby was born too soon, they would have a good chance at surviving. And in the UK, they match their abortion limit to the viability time, which philosophically makes sense. Philosophically makes sense in a way. When I was your all's age, it was about 26 weeks. So probably every 4 years, it goes back by a week because we get better medical technology. But right now, this year, it's about 23 weeks, as long as you're close to major metro hospital. Like if this happened to you around here, where would you go? What hospital did it? Creamies? Well, they go to Johnson City first. And then if it's really bad, they again get transported to Vanderbilt. I didn't define what around here means, but. So we're gonna stop there. Yeah.
Before you know.
Mhm.
I was watching a show of Grey's Anatomy like 2 weeks ago, and so the lady was like about to have her child. Well, no, she was about to have an abortion, and so they were like driving somewhere. But like something happened, I think like a water burst, ended up dying in the child. But like when there's a situation where the child, I guess, is like born too early, how do they like what is the first person they try to save? Like, how do they be like, hey, I'm gonna go save this baby?
That's, I'm gonna think about how to answer that. So it's complicated. It's complicated, and I'm gonna try to remember to answer that at the start of the next lecture. It depends on a lot of things, is the unsatisfying answer.
And I'm like, you know, they're like, save my baby.
Oh, wait, don't.
Why?
Can you guys one picture?
Which one? The Carnegie
All of-
stages? Yeah.
They like, save
Let me
my
stop
Where?
recording right now.
baby. That's right.
Perfect.
I'm not down.